So let's break down this track very quickly and show you how I'm using a noise gate to achieve ducking effects similar to sidechain compression. So what we have here is very simple. We've basically got a bass sound with an alternative bass sound for the sort of the end of a couple of the bars. We have a higher sound which is essentially the exact same bass patch which is pitched up, and then we have two sidechain triggers. So the first sidechain trigger is happening exactly when the kick is happening in our drum pattern, and this is triggering the bass to duck down when the kicks are hitting. The higher synth part, we're using a second sidechain with a different pattern to give it a little bit more interest and variation. So very quickly, we've got an Alchemy patch. This is just one of the default settings in Alchemy, and that sounds like this. So it's already got a rhythmical, I suppose you could call it a gated effect. It's got a rhythmical quality to the bass. But let me play you that with the drums. We might feel that that's too much. Perhaps from a mixing point of view, we've got a bit of a conflict between the kick and the bass, and we want to remove the bass when the kicks are happening, to clean up the mix and to help with any conflict that we're getting in the lower frequencies. Alternatively, we might just want to introduce some ducking for a more of a stylistic reason. What I'm using here is I've basically copied the Ultra Beat, which is a drum sampler I'm using for the drums. I've copied that patch over. I've removed everything apart from the kick drums, and in fact I've got two sets of MIDI notes, and I only really need this one on C#1, and this is our MIDI trigger. So if I just open this up quickly, I'm sending this to bus 1, and bus 1 is set to no output, so I'm just going to switch that back for the time being so you can hear what's going on. Sorry, apologies. Let's just solo the trigger on its own. Let's just solo the trigger on its own. There we go. And this, believe it or not, is actually just the kick drum, which I've affected in a few ways. I'll show you what I've done. First of all, I've pitched it up. So if I bring that back down, I'm also got a low shelf, which is all the way up to 1600 Hertz. So if I drop that down, and then I've also reduced the decay time to a very short decay, so that on the amp envelope this is so that we're getting just a very short, quick click for our trigger. So there we go, that's the original kick sound more or less. So I've pitched it up somewhere. Filtered out everything but the very high frequencies and shorten the decay time. So now we've just got a very short click, which is going to be ideal for our sidechain trigger. In addition to the basic Alchemy patch, I've added an Isotope Trash 2 to give us some grit and gnarly distortion. I'm using some EQ as well, just to cut some of the local frequencies so it's not too bright and harsh in those higher frequencies. And I'm using a bit crusher. It's set to clip mode, so I'm using it like a clipper to make sure that we don't peak over. I've pulled down the clip level as well to -1 dB, so we're not going to go beyond that threshold. And then I'm also sending this to a bus, which I'm using as a sort of dedicated sub channel. which is EQing out all of the high frequencies. I've got a head crusher plugin with the tone brought down, which really helps to add some weight in the low end, and again a bit crusher to stop us clipping. So now what we're doing is we're going to add a gate, and we're going to use the sidechain trigger to make sure that the gate is reacting every time the trigger happens. Now normally with a noise gate, what this would mean is that every time the trigger happens, the noise gate would open and allow the sound through. And then according to the controls that we have, as soon as the trigger finishes, our release times, etc., will cause the noise gate to close back down and the sound will shut off. In this instant, when we're doing ducking, what we want to do is the complete reverse of that. When the trigger happens, we want the noise gate to close to shut the sound, and then as soon as the trigger finishes, we want that noise gate to open and to allow the sound through, which is the reverse of normal. Now with the stock Logic noise gate plugin, in the newest version we have this ducker, which is exactly what we need to allow us to get these ducking effects. So let me just, okay, we've got the sidechain soloed, and with the ducking on, oh hang on, I need to set the sidechain input, so we want that side bus 1. We can use these different settings, the threshold, the amount of ducking, the attack, the hold, release, to kind of shape it the way that we want to make sure that the bass sound is ducking down when the kick's happening. However, in previous versions of Logic and earlier inceptions of this noise gate plugin, we don't have the ducker option. It's quite a new feature as far as I'm aware. If you are running with an old version of Logic and you have the old noise gate, there is a way around that you can still get this effect. Let me just demonstrate that for you quickly. So if I turn this back to a normal gate, I'm going to pull the reduction all the way down. I'm going to go push the threshold up. Let's just set these to 0 for the time being. So now what we should be getting, so this is a noise gate working in its sort of standard form, where it is acting according to the sidechain trigger and the gate's opening when that trigger happens. If I increase the release, we'll get a longer tail before the noise gate completely shuts off. And that'll give us a smoother transition. We can increase the hold to make that even more dramatic. And we can use the attack to affect the attack time of that. But this is the opposite that we want for this ducking, because we don't want the bass hitting at the same time as the kick drum. We want it, when the kick drum finishes, we want the bass to be heard. So the way around this, if you're using an old version of the noise gate, is basically to set up a sidechain trigger that happens in the gaps between the kicks, something like this, and we may need to just play around with it, but hopefully let's just put the drums back in, see what it sounds like. One good thing about doing it this way is that when we're using the gate in the normal way, we have this reduction dial, which allows us to dial back in some of the dry signal. So at the moment, when the sound is ducking down, we're getting apart from the sort of tail from the release, the sound is completely disappearing, the volume is dropping to 0. With this reduction, we can actually introduce some of that back, so it's not going from completely on to completely off. It just drops down in volume, and we can adjust the amount that we want this. So let's just have a listen to that without the drums. So hopefully there you can hear the difference between having the reduction at minus 100 dB, basically off, as opposed to when we're actually introducing some of that signal back in, and it's not a hard on off, and it's more of an undulating feel, which sometimes may be more preferable. One problem about using the trigger like this, where we're having the triggers happening in between the kicks, at the moment with this pattern we've got a 4 to the floor kick. It's quite easy to set up. If we've got something with a more complex kick pattern, or we've got something that varies quite a lot, maybe at every 4 bars or whatever it might be, having to go through and draw MIDI notes in all of the spaces in between can be a little bit time consuming, and sometimes that slows down our creative process. But just so you know, there is a way around it, and you can still achieve this. Using it where you're having the sidechain trigger every time the kick's hitting, all you need to do is copy your drum track over to the trigger track, and the kicks will be already there, following the pattern of your drums. And all you need to do is spend a little bit of time setting it up so that you get the click, as we demonstrated with the trigger channel here. You can also set this up so that you could mute every other sound apart from the kick sound, and that way when you copy your, let me just do that so I can copy the drums over, and it doesn't matter that we've got all of these other MIDI notes in there, it will still only be, let me just turn this back on. We will still only be hearing the kick, and that way that's the only thing that will be affecting the sidechain. So that's quite a useful way of doing things. Another way you can do this is if you have a third-party plugin, noise gate plugin, that has the ability to switch between the sidechain trigger reacting in the normal way and flipping it, flipping the polarity of it so that it affects the other way. For that, I like to use the Kilohearts noise gate. It's a very good plugin. It's very inexpensive. I think I paid less than £17 sterling. And this, again, I set this to bus 1, so that's our sidechain input. And here we have a flip button. So in normal mode, it's opening every time the trigger happens. But when I flip out, I was wondering there why that wasn't working. I've just realised that I've still got these. I've left these. Okay. Let's try that again. So in normal mode, the noise gate will react thusly. So you can hear that pulsing at the same time that the kick's hitting, which it may be something that we want. Often, especially when this is being used as a mixing technique in order to clean up our mixes and try and make them as punchy and as clean as possible, this is the opposite of what we want. So with this flip button, we now get So for me, this is easier to set up and to use than the Logic noise gate, because we also have this range button, which is essentially the same as the reduction dial in the Logic noise gate. So if you just have a listen to this, so that's fully engaged, and that's where we're cutting the signal completely when the trigger's happening. But we can drop this down and introduce some of the dry signal back in. And we can of course adjust this to taste. So that's that. Very quickly we'll show you this higher sound. That's being triggered by Sidechain 2. And so for this one I've got a different pattern generating the triggers. It's just so that we get a bit more interest, and because this one is pitched up, there's not really going to be any conflict with the kick drum. And it's really just to give us a more rhythmic interest, a bit more stylistic decision for this particular. But again, it's the opposite to the earlier demonstration. So the trigger is actually causing the noise gate to duck down. So that's essentially it. I'm just going to show you quickly as well. I actually automated in basically bypassing the gate, so on and off. The main reason for that is if I just loop this section here, so I'm going to have to play it from the start, apologies. Let me just turn, actually let's turn this off and turn the gate off. So where we've got that kind of stuttery sound towards the end of the note, I quite like that. If I just engage the gate, it's not so pronounced because the gate's affecting, let me just, I want to push that a little bit higher because I want quite a pumping sort of sound with this, but it's affecting this last little bit, which I quite like. So I've introduced a bypass. So at the end of the phrase here, we're getting that stuttery staccato kind of thing happening. I've also introduced it a little bit at the start of the note, every other sort of bar, so that let's just put the drums in to give it some context. Hang on. Apologies. I haven't got it flipped. That's why it's sounding weird. So that's just adding an extra sort of slight bit of dimension to it. That's just a little sort of artistic thing that I thought might sound quite nice and give it a little bit of variation. So that's something you might want to think about doing, automating the noise gate. You can either automate it to bypass a come on and off. You could automate the threshold. You could automate various parameters and create a bit more interest in the sound. But there we go. So this is how to use a noise gate similar to how you'd use sidechain compression in order to create ducking effects, whether that's for mix reasons or for creative ones. So there we go, noise gates. Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you for sticking with me. I hope to see you again soon. I really want to start making a lot more videos. I've been very slack recently. I apologise profusely for this, but hopefully I'll see you again soon. Thanks for tuning in. Click that like button or not, whatever. Hopefully I'll see you again soon.